They were stolen, silenced, and hidden beneath the cold steel of a shipping yard. 8 children, frightened, bruised, and left to vanish in the dark. No warmth, no safety, just fear and silence. And no one moved until he did. A loyal German shepherd named Ranger, once trained to serve, now standing against an empire of cruelty. Alongside Officer Luke and Vanessa, he walked into a battlefield no one else dared to face. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe children deserve safety, not suffering, hit that subscribe button, because this story will stay with you forever. The winter night in Baltimore clung to the city like a damp shroud. Harbor fog drifted low, wrapping the red-bricked warehouses and narrow alleys in a ghostly haze. Street lamps sputtered, casting cones of pale orange light over cracked pavements slick with rain and ice. The faint echo of tugboat horns rolled in from the harbor, while the cold bit at every breath, sharpening the silence between sounds. The city was alive in its own way, yet it felt deserted, as if something unseen lurked in the void between the buildings. Officer Luke Bennett tightened his coat against the chill. 37 years old, tall but lean, his square jaw shadowed by 2 days of stubble, Luke carried the look of a man whose burdens were more internal than external. His gray eyes held both weariness and resolve, the kind of gaze that had stared too long at crime scenes and broken lives yet refused to turn away. Luke had grown up in a working-class neighborhood of Baltimore, son of a dock worker and a school teacher. His father's death in a steel mill accident when Luke was 15 had pressed early responsibility onto his shoulders, shaping a man both cautious and quietly stubborn. He had become a police officer not out of ambition, but because he couldn't stand walking past injustice without trying to stop it. Beside him padded Ranger, a German shepherd with thick black and tan fur, streaked with lighter shades along his chest. His left ear bent slightly at the tip, a scar traced faintly along his right flank, souvenirs of a past fight that few humans even knew about. Ranger was 9 years old, considered aging for a service dog, but his amber eyes glowed with intelligence and loyalty. He was muscular, though leaner than in his prime, moving with the quiet grace of a predator softened by training. To strangers he appeared imposing, but to those who knew him, he was gentle, almost soulful. Luke had named him Ranger the day he first brought the dog home from the K9 Academy. Years before, when Luke had been a boy, his father used to take him hiking in the Appalachian foothills. They would follow ranger trails marked with faded signs, and Luke's father always said, "Rangers keep watch. They protect people even when no one notices." When Luke adopted the shepherd pup, his instincts had whispered the same. This dog would be more than a companion, he would be a watchman. In time, Ranger had proved the name true, not only by sniffing out hidden drugs or chasing fleeing suspects, but by sensing despair in children, pressing his head into their hands until they smiled. Ranger was not just trained for service. He had a gift, as if something deeper than instinct burned in his chest. This evening, their patrol route took them through the quieter streets near Pratt Street, close to the old fish market. The area was lined with shuttered shops, graffiti-tagged doors, and dumpsters leaking the sour odor of decay. The city had long since shifted its commerce toward glossier tourist attractions near the inner harbor, leaving these back streets to shadows. Luke walked in silence, his breath puffing like smoke, while Ranger's nails clicked softly on the wet pavement. Ranger suddenly slowed, his ears perked, nose twitching into the damp wind. Luke noticed the shift immediately. For days, the dog had been restless, more alert than usual, pulling slightly against the leash as if driven by some invisible current. Now, Ranger stopped dead, his body tensing, hackles rising. "What is it, boy?" Luke whispered, already reaching for his flashlight. Without warning, Ranger pulled toward a narrow alley between 2 abandoned buildings. The leash strained as the dog surged forward, nails scraping across the wet cement. Luke followed, his instincts prickling. The alley smelled of rust, rotting garbage, and something metallic that churned Luke's stomach before his light even swept across it. Half hidden beneath a sagging piece of cardboard lay a backpack. Faded blue fabric, one strap torn, its zipper half open as if hastily shoved aside. Luke crouched, flashlight beam steady. His gut tightened. There were stains on the fabric, dark, dried, unmistakable. Blood. Ranger lowered his head, ears pinned, and let out a low growl, deep and resonant, the kind that warned of something more than simple fear. Luke slowly reached for the bag, fingers brushing damp fabric. He unzipped it, and the contents spilled into view. A small plastic doll, arm snapped at the shoulder, its painted eyes staring blankly. Beneath it lay a child's shirt, once white, now stiff with blood. Luke's throat went dry. He whispered, "God," and glanced at Ranger, whose amber eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the backpack, as if he understood the gravity of what they'd found. At that moment, footsteps approached from the mouth of the alley. It was Vanessa Green, her breath misting in the cold as she hurried toward them. Vanessa was 41, a black woman with a slim frame, neatly tied bun, and wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a thick, second-hand winter coat, a little too large for her, the fabric worn at the cuffs. By profession, she was a social worker, known in the community for her tireless nights monitoring a battered police radio in her living room. She was sharp-eyed, compassionate, but hardened by years of seeing children slip through the cracks of a system that didn't always care. Vanessa's upbringing had taught her resilience. Raised in a segregated corner of Maryland, she'd watched her own mother work 2 jobs as a nurse and janitor, only to be dismissed or mistrusted by authorities. Those scars had made Vanessa distrustful of the system but fiercely protective of children. Before she could step closer, a young uniformed officer moved to block her. His posture was tense, hand resting unnecessarily near his holster. "Ma'am, this is an active scene. Identification, please." Vanessa held up her social work ID calmly, though her eyes narrowed at the unnecessary suspicion. "I was called. Officer Bennett asked me to be here." The younger officer frowned. "Still need clearance. Can't just let anyone walk in." Luke straightened, anger flashing in his gray eyes. "She's with me," he said sharply. "She's the one who keeps half these kids from falling off the grid. You'll let her through." The young officer hesitated, then stepped aside reluctantly. Vanessa moved forward, her gaze falling on the backpack. For a brief second, her professional composure cracked, her lips trembled, and she placed a hand lightly on Ranger's back, as though anchoring herself in his steady presence. Ranger didn't flinch. He simply sat, gaze locked forward, chest rising like a sentinel guarding the truth. Vanessa whispered, "That's a child's. Someone didn't want it found." Her voice was both fierce and broken, as though the pain of too many similar nights echoed behind it. Luke exhaled heavily, radioing in. "Unit 6, we've got evidence of possible child involvement. Blood present. Request backup." His voice was calm, but his heart hammered in his chest. He set the backpack carefully down, unwilling to disturb more than necessary. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, the sound ricocheting off brick walls. Luke's pulse jumped. He looked up at the dog, then to Vanessa. Both of them knew. This was not the end of something, it was the beginning. The sirens of distant patrol cars murmured faintly through the damp night, but in the narrow alley near Pratt Street, time seemed to thicken. The cold gnawed at Luke Bennett's knuckles as he steadied his flashlight against the slick brick wall. Rainwater trickled down from broken gutters above, pooling into shallow puddles that mirrored the pale, jaundiced glow of the street lamps. Ranger's amber eyes gleamed in that dim light, his body taut, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air like he was reading an invisible script written across the city's skin. Luke crouched low, following Ranger's fixed stare. On the wet concrete, among scattered leaves and refuse, lay a single print. Small, barefoot, a child's. Its edges were softened by rain, but the shape remained clear. The roundness of tiny toes, the delicate arch of a young soul pressed into the grime. Luke's breath caught. He looked instinctively for more prints, scanning in widening circles, but the ground offered nothing. No adult footsteps, no dragging marks, no explanation. Just one solitary sign of life that should not have been alone. Vanessa Green, still hugging her coat tighter against the cutting wind, bent down beside Luke. Her glasses caught the flashlight beam, and behind the lenses, her eyes were sharp but heavy with unspoken stories. "One footprint," she whispered, her voice a mix of dread and certainty. "That's not a child running free. That's a child who's been made to disappear." At that moment, Luke's radio hissed with static. He adjusted the frequency and called dispatch to request nearby camera feeds. Vanessa, already anticipating resistance, had pulled out her own battered cell phone and dialed the number for city surveillance support. A man's voice answered, brusque, irritated as though woken from sleep. "City security, what's the issue?" "This is Vanessa Green," she said evenly. "Community Social Services Liaison. We need feeds from Pier 14 and surrounding blocks. There was a 12-minute blackout. I need to know why. The voice on the other end chuckled faintly. Ma'am, maybe you're reading the logs wrong. These systems don't just blink out. Are you even authorized? Vanessa's lips pressed tight. She adjusted her glasses with deliberate calm, though her pulse raced. Check again. 12 minutes, 22:34 to 22:46. Your cameras went blind exactly when a child was taken. Silence. Then a dismissive sigh. We'll look into it, but you can't expect us to chase every rumor. The line clicked dead. Luke, who had been listening, saw the faint tremor in Vanessa's hand as she lowered her phone. He spoke quietly but firmly. You were right. That's enough. I'll file a request through official channels. Ranger gave a sharp bark, as if cutting off any further debate. His nose was to the ground again, tail stiff, pulling toward the far end of the alley. Without waiting, he surged forward, his muscles rippling beneath his thick coat. Luke followed, and Vanessa quickened her stride despite the cold seeping through her shoes. The alley opened onto a service road leading down toward the shipping yards where the night smelled of salt, diesel, and rust. The chain-link fences rattled faintly in the wind, and beyond them, cranes loomed like frozen giants against the cloudy sky. At the edge of the road, a figure stood waiting, silhouetted by the glow of a flickering lamppost. He was stocky, perhaps mid-50s, wearing a heavy canvas jacket smeared with grease and oil. His cap was pulled low, but when he turned, the light caught a face lined with exhaustion and suspicion. This was Henry Dalton, a longtime dock worker who'd spent 30 years hauling crates and fixing machinery at the harbor. His back was slightly hunched, his skin weathered from years of salt air, and his gray stubble bristled as he chewed absently on a toothpick. Henry was known for being blunt, a man who distrusted authority after watching too many politicians promise revitalization that never reached the docks. You shouldn't be here, Henry grumbled, his voice a gravelly rumble. Pier 14's not safe at night. Cameras went down, alarms too. Whole thing stinks. He glanced at Vanessa briefly, his eyes narrowing in guarded recognition. Didn't expect you here. Vanessa met his look without flinching. Children are missing, Henry. That's why we're here. You've seen things. Tell us. Henry spat the toothpick into the gutter, glancing nervously at the looming warehouses. I saw a white van, no plates, parked by the service gate, around the time those cameras blacked out. Didn't belong to any crew I know. They loaded something heavy too quiet, too careful. Could have been crates, but... He trailed off, eyes flicking toward the single footprint Luke had photographed. Luke stepped closer. Did you see who was driving? Henry shook his head. Couldn't see his face, but he walked like a man who didn't belong back too straight, like he wasn't a worker. Had gloves on, expensive ones. Ranger sniffed the ground, circling Henry briefly before tugging toward the chain-link fence. Luke followed the dog's pull, lifting his flashlight. Beyond the fence lay the service entrance to Pier 14, its lock broken, gate hanging askew. The asphalt glistened with fresh rain, but there, a faint smear of something darker. Blood, mixed with rainwater, trailing toward the shadowed warehouses. Luke's jaw tightened. He felt the weight of the night pressing heavier. They went this way. Henry muttered a curse under his breath, pulling his jacket tighter. You go in there, you'd better be ready. The harbor keeps secrets. Not all of them like to be found. With that, he turned and limped back into the fog, vanishing like a man who had already said too much. Vanessa adjusted her scarf, her breath clouding in the air. He's scared. And if Henry Dalton's scared, that means something worse than usual is hiding down there. Ranger barked again, pawing at the gap in the fence, urging them onward. Luke nodded grimly. Then that's where we go. Together, the three of them, cop, social worker, and dog, stepped through the broken gate into the silence of Pier 14. The night swallowed them whole. The harbor loomed darker the deeper they went. Fog from the Chesapeake pressed low across the wharves, the smell of salt water and rusted iron clinging to every breath. The looming cranes overhead, frozen in their stillness, resembled gallows stretching against a bruise-colored sky. Luke Bennett moved forward with his flashlight, sweeping arcs of light over puddles and broken pallets, his jaw locked tight. Ranger walked just ahead, the leash slack, his nose pressed close to the ground, body rigid with certainty. Vanessa Green trailed just behind, her scarf drawn higher, every step ringing louder than it should against the empty concrete. Warehouse 14 came into view, its corrugated steel siding streaked with rust and decades of neglect. A single lamp above the service entrance flickered weakly, painting the gate in an anemic glow. The iron door, tall and heavy, sagged on its hinges. The padlock that should have secured it lay broken on the ground, the metal twisted as though wrenched apart by more than human hands. Ranger pressed forward, lowering his body, and slipped under the gap where the gate no longer met the ground. His tail remained stiff, ears high. Luke crouched, feeling the bite of the cold concrete against his knees, and swung the gate inward with a groan that echoed across the silent yard. The sound was like a creature exhaling after a long sleep, metallic and resentful. The air inside was colder, heavy with the antiseptic bite of ammonia and the deep hum of machinery. Massive refrigeration units coughed and hissed, their mechanical breath condensing into small clouds that floated like ghosts across the concrete floor. Luke's flashlight beam cut across the interior rows of metal shelving, stacked crates, abandoned forklifts, the shadows weaving themselves into ominous shapes. On the ground, a dark smear stretched forward in a wavering path. Luke knelt and touched it lightly with gloved fingers, then lifted them to the light. Blood, wet even in this cold. His stomach tightened as he followed the trail with his eyes. It led deeper into the warehouse, toward the far corner where the floor panels looked different, slightly newer, as though they covered something. "Someone tried to clean it," Vanessa said quietly, pointing to the uneven streaks where water had mixed with blood. Her voice carried a mix of steel and sorrow, the tone of someone who had seen too many cover-ups. She adjusted her glasses, breath misting against the lenses, before continuing. "They wanted to hide it, but not enough time. Something interrupted them." A figure suddenly emerged from the shadows near the machinery, startling both Luke and Vanessa. He was a tall man, thick-shouldered, his navy security jacket zipped halfway up over a broad chest. His cap bore the emblem of the dock authority, but his face was lined with contempt. This was Carl Henson, mid-40s, a veteran guard of the port facilities. His skin was ruddy from years of working night shifts in the cold, and his pale blue eyes darted between Luke and Vanessa with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his voice gravelly from cigarettes. "This is restricted property. And you?" His gaze locked on Vanessa, a sneer curling his lips. "Bringing a social worker here? A woman like you's just going to stir up more trouble. Don't you people have somewhere else to lecture?" Vanessa's face hardened, though she said nothing at first. She had endured enough nights where her presence was questioned not for her skill but for her skin. Luke stepped between them, his gray eyes sharp. "We found evidence of a child. Blood on this floor. You want to explain how that fits into your definition of restricted?" Carl's mouth twitched, his bravado faltering for a split second. He tried to regain control, crossing his arms. "You're imagining things. Probably animal blood. This is a shipping yard, officer. Things spill." Ranger moved forward, hackles rising, a low growl vibrating from his chest. He sniffed the blood trail and barked sharply, the sound echoing through the cavernous warehouse. Carl stepped back instinctively, muttering a curse. Luke moved past the guard, unwilling to waste time. Vanessa followed, her voice steady despite the burn of humiliation from Carl's comment. "If you had nothing to hide, you wouldn't be sweating right now." The blood trail grew heavier as they approached the far corner. Ranger's paws tapped against the floor until he stopped abruptly, pawing at the ground. Luke crouched and ran his hand over the metal plating beneath. It was different, newer steel, bolted tightly, but faint scuff marks around the edges suggested it had been opened often. Luke's flashlight caught something glinting in the corner, a small object, dropped and forgotten. Vanessa bent down, retrieving it carefully. It was a button, tiny and blue, the kind sewn on a child's coat. She held it delicately in her palm, her lips pressing into a line. From the shadows above, a sudden clang echoed, a metal beam shifting as though disturbed by weight. Luke snapped his light upward, his hand instinctively near his sidearm. A rat scurried across the rafters, tail whipping. But Luke's instincts hummed. Someone had been here recently. Carl shifted uneasily behind them, his earlier confidence evaporating. "You should leave. This place isn't what you think." Luke turned, narrowing his gaze. "Then you tell me what it is." But Carl said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. Ranger's growl deepened, his body pressing against the corner plate, claws scraping at the steel as though demanding it be opened. The trail of blood ended there, smeared across the edges of the hatch. The sound of the refrigeration units seemed to grow louder, like a beast breathing down their necks. Luke straightened slowly. "There's something under here." Vanessa's hand trembled as she held the tiny blue button. Children don't lose coats in warehouses. Not unless they're forced here. Carl took a step back, sweat gleaming along his hairline despite the cold. You don't know what you're getting into. Ranger barked once more, the sharp, urgent cry of a sentinel demanding action. Luke looked at Vanessa, then at the trembling button in her hand. The air was heavy, oppressive, yet unyielding. They both knew this was not the end of their search. This was the beginning of something much darker. The groan of metal bolts gave way to a hollow clang as Luke pried the hatch open. Cold air rushed upward, sharper and damper than the already freezing warehouse, carrying with it the stench of mildew, sweat, and something sourer, the tang of fear long trapped in the dark. Ranger leaned forward instantly, his ears sharp, his body tensed as he sniffed the void below. His amber eyes flickered like torches guiding them into an underworld. Luke switched his flashlight on and lowered the beam into the hole. The light revealed concrete steps descending into a cramped underground chamber, walls stained with moisture. The deeper the light traveled, the clearer the shapes became, children. A small figure sat bound to a chair, wrists tied with fraying rope, wide eyes staring up toward the light with a mixture of terror and fragile hope. Around her lay 7 other children collapsed on the floor, limbs tangled, lips tinted blue from cold, skin blotched with bruises. The sight punched the breath out of Luke's lungs. The girl in the chair could not have been older than 9. Her hair was dark, matted against her cheeks, her skin pale under the grime. Even in the dim light, her thin shoulders trembled, not only from cold but from exhaustion. Her name, they would later learn, was Emily Carter, a child from a working-class family in East Baltimore who had disappeared on her walk home from school 3 nights earlier. Emily's spirit was fragile but not broken. Her eyes, though wide with fear, held a spark desperation begging for salvation. Ranger moved first. He padded carefully down the steps, his heavy frame low and deliberate so as not to frighten the children further. Emily flinched as he approached, then froze, tears glinting in her eyes. The dog sniffed her bound hands, then pressed his muzzle gently into her palm. The warmth of fur against her cold skin broke something open in her chest. A sob escaped her lips as her fingers trembled against him, clutching his fur like an anchor. Luke followed, boots echoing in the chamber. He knelt by the unconscious children, 2 boys curled together near a broken crate, a girl sprawled on her side, cheeks mottled with frostbite. Each child's breathing was shallow but present. Relief tempered the dread only slightly. Luke's voice, hoarse but steady, filled the room. They're alive. God, they're alive. Vanessa descended last, her flashlight steady despite the shake in her hand. Her professional mask held firm, though her heart cracked with each child she scanned. She crouched beside Emily, adjusting her glasses as her voice softened into the tone she used with vulnerable clients. It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We've got you. Emily's lips quivered. Will you take us home? Her voice was a faint whisper, raspy from thirst. Luke swallowed hard, forcing his emotions down into his gut. He unclipped his radio and barked into it. Dispatch Unit 6, we have multiple children, possible abductions, critical condition. We need ambulances at Pier 14, Warehouse 14, immediate. His tone left no room for hesitation. The radio crackled back with static and a clipped reply. Copy, units en route. Ranger circled the unconscious children, pressing his nose into each small body, nudging them gently as if to remind them they were not alone. When he stopped beside a boy of perhaps 7, his ears flattened, and he whined softly. The boy's skin was colder than the others, but when Luke pressed 2 fingers to his neck, a faint pulse beat stubbornly. Vanessa stood, pulling out her phone. She dialed quickly, reaching Father Thomas McHale, the parish priest at St. Francis, a man in his late 60s who had served the community for decades. Short and round-bellied, with a balding head fringed by white hair, Father Thomas was known for his unwavering devotion to the poor, often opening the parish basement to the homeless when shelters overflowed. His raspy Irish-accented voice answered after a single ring. Father, it's Vanessa. I've got children, 8 of them. They need warmth, shelter. We need St. Francis open tonight. There was a pause. Then the old priest's voice grew firm. The church is open. I'll call the volunteers. Get them here safely. As she hung up, a paramedic crew finally responded on the radio, but when they arrived minutes later, one younger medic hesitated at the hatch. He was Brian Peters, 26, fresh out of training, freckles across his pale face, his blonde hair sticking damp against his forehead. His inexperience showed in his hesitation as he peered down at the children. His brows knitted. This information, is it confirmed? Are you sure this isn't some false alarm? Vanessa's patience was thin but controlled. She stepped close, her voice low but cutting with authority. Confirmed or not, these are children. They're freezing, they're bleeding, and they don't have 12 more minutes for your paperwork. Do your job. Brian flushed red, stammered, then quickly began unloading blankets and medical kits. The senior medic beside him, a woman named Sophia Martinez, mid-30s, with dark hair in a braid and eyes hardened from years of trauma response, gave Vanessa a brief nod of respect. We'll take it from here. You did the right thing. As the paramedics worked, Luke gently untied Emily's wrists. The rope left angry red marks around her skin, and he winced as he rubbed circulation back into her hands. You're safe now, he murmured. Emily looked past him to Ranger, who had not moved far from her side. She leaned against the shepherd's thick coat, her voice breaking into sobs. He found us! He found us! Ranger stayed still, his chest rising steady, his presence grounding every tear in the room. Up above, Carl Henson, the security guard from earlier, lingered at the hatch's edge, his face pale. His earlier hostility was gone, replaced by unease. He muttered to himself, just loud enough for Luke to catch, "You don't know what you've stepped into." Luke looked up sharply, but Carl had already turned, retreating into the warehouse shadows. The ambulances roared into the yard, red lights casting jagged shadows across the corrugated steel walls. Children were lifted out one by one, wrapped in silver emergency blankets that crinkled under their tiny bodies. Emily clung stubbornly to Ranger's fur until Luke gently assured her the dog would be by her side soon. As the last child was carried up, Vanessa remained at the bottom of the steps, staring at the empty chamber. The air was thick with the ghosts of silence. Her shoulders slumped, but then she straightened, whispering to herself. Whether confirmed or not, they deserve warmth. Ranger barked once, sharp and resonant, as if echoing her vow. Báo cáo trùng lập and tóm tắt tiếng Việt báo cáo. Không có chi tiết nào trùng lập y nguyên. Các tình tiết được phát triển mới. Giới thiệu Emily Carter, bé gái bị trói. Giới thiệu nhân viên y tế Brian Peters và Sophia Martinez. Giới thiệu cha xứ Thomas McHale. Thêm chi tiết kịch tính giữa Vanessa và nhân viên cứu hộ, cũng như hành động của Ranger với các bé. The metallic screech of stretcher wheels still echoed faintly from the yard above when the atmosphere inside Warehouse 14 shifted like a storm breaking. Luke had just finished calling in the final update on the children's condition when Ranger froze mid-step, his ears swiveling toward the shadowed mezzanine above the refrigeration units. His amber eyes locked onto movement, body coiled, ready. Then came the sound-heavy boots on steel grating, the distinct clack of a rifle being cocked. Luke snapped his head up, heart slamming into his ribs. From the catwalk, 3 men emerged, their silhouettes cut against the faint glow of industrial lamps, armed with assault rifles fitted with suppressors. Their movements were practiced, too fluid to be amateurs. The first was a tall, wiry man with a shaved head and a jagged scar along his jawline. His name, Luke would later learn, was Victor Hale, an ex-mercenary who had drifted into criminal networks after dishonorable discharge from private security work overseas. His angular frame and the calculated way he scanned the room revealed a predator used to reading chaos. Beside him trudged Miguel Torres, broader, heavyset, mid-30s, his dark hair slicked back with oil. Tattoos of skeletal hands crawled up his thick neck, and his jaw constantly worked as though chewing on invisible gum. Miguel was known in the docks as muscle for hire, a man with little loyalty beyond money. The third, hanging slightly back, was Eddie Larkin, the youngest of the group, barely in his 20s. His face was sharp but pockmarked, his eyes flickering with a nervous energy that betrayed inexperience. Eddie's baggy jacket hung awkwardly on his narrow frame, and though his rifle was gripped tight, his hands trembled slightly. A runaway turned hired gun. Eddie had fallen into crime-chasing belonging, but found only exploitation. Luke didn't wait. "Cover!" he barked, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. But the mercenaries already fired. Suppressed shots cracked like thunder swallowed by steel walls, sparks leaping as bullets ricocheted off the refrigerated units. Ranger launched forward like a streak of fury. His muscles coiled and released, his paws slamming the ground with thunderous rhythm as he lunged straight at Miguel, who had dropped to ground level. The German shepherd's jaws clamped around the man's forearm with the force of iron, sending the rifle clattering across the floor. Miguel roared, thrashing violently, but Ranger held firm, growling deep, his body twisting with every attempt to disarm his target. Luke rolled across the concrete, firing 2 shots toward Victor, who had taken position on the catwalk. One bullet clipped metal near Victor's shoulder, forcing him to duck, but the scarred man didn't falter. His training showed in his steady return fire. Bullets sparked near Luke's boots, forcing him to slide behind a forklift for cover. Vanessa, still near the stairwell where the children had been lifted out, spotted sudden movement. Eddie had slipped along the far side of the warehouse, his nervous fingers squeezing the trigger wildly. Bullets sprang across crates stacked with rusting steel parts. One of the rounds shattered a floodlight, raining glass shards. A sliver slashed Vanessa's cheek as she dove low, her voice tearing through the chaos. "Luke, left side!" Her eyes widened. One of the smallest children, barely conscious, had been left briefly on a makeshift cot awaiting transport. Eddie's wild firing line was tearing toward that corner. Vanessa didn't think. She sprinted forward, sliding across the slick floor as bullets spat sparks inches above her. She grabbed the child, yanking him against her chest, and rolled behind a stack of pallets. A shard of metal sheared loose in the firefight, grazing her cheek and leaving a thin line of blood. She barely registered it. The boy's frightened whimper was the only sound she cared about. "Stay down," she whispered, shielding him with her body. Luke popped from behind the forklift, steadying his breath. His father had taught him long ago that fear sharpened the senses but clouded judgment if not controlled. He aimed deliberately, squeezing off 2 more rounds. One struck the railing inches from Victor, showering sparks, driving him back deeper onto the catwalk. Meanwhile, Ranger twisted, using his weight to slam Miguel against a crate. The man staggered, trying desperately to pull free, his tattooed arm bleeding under the dog's relentless bite. Finally, with a howl of pain, he smashed his knee upward into Ranger's ribs. The shepherd yelped, momentarily releasing. Miguel swung a fist, but Ranger ducked and surged back, slamming his body against the man's chest, knocking him onto the cold concrete. Eddie, panicked, turned his fire wildly toward the dog, but his shots went high, shredding metal sheets. Luke snapped a shot in his direction. The bullet struck the ground near Eddie's foot, scattering concrete chips. The young gunman screamed, stumbling back, his rifle clattering from his grip. Victor barked an order in a language Luke didn't recognize, his scarred face twisting in frustration. He raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, a sharp bark split the cacophony. Ranger, his chest heaving, leaped from Miguel and bounded toward the stairwell leading up to the catwalk. His paws clanged against steel steps, the sound like war drums. Vanessa shouted up, "Luke, he's heading to the top!" Luke moved, sprinting across open ground under Victor's fire. A bullet screamed past his ear, searing the air. Another grazed his shoulder lightly, burning through fabric. Still he pushed, boots pounding. Ranger reached the catwalk first, charging at Victor with a guttural snarl. The mercenary raised his rifle. Too slow, Ranger's body collided with his chest, jaws snapping around the man's shoulder. Victor crashed back against the railing, metal groaning under the force. His weapon tumbled from his grip. Luke arrived seconds later, slamming his pistol against Victor's temple, sending him sprawling to the grated floor. Below, Miguel lay groaning in a pool of his own blood, subdued by Ranger's earlier assault. Eddie, trembling and unarmed, raised his hands, his thin chest heaving. Tears welled in his eyes as his voice cracked. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't—" He dropped to his knees, muttering like a child caught in a nightmare. Vanessa emerged from behind the pallets, her cheek bleeding, but the boy safe in her arms. She glared at the scene, her voice steady despite exhaustion. They weren't protecting cargo. They were protecting monsters. Luke cuffed Victor, breathing hard. "And we've just torn the mask off one of them." Ranger stood between the fallen men and his human partners, his chest heaving, fur streaked with blood that wasn't his. His amber eyes gleamed in the harsh industrial light, steady and unbroken, as though he had always known this night would come. The night carried them away from the industrial chill of the harbor toward higher ground, where the city gave way to winding suburban roads and old estates perched like watchmen above Baltimore. The flashing ambulance lights were long gone, leaving Luke's cruiser and an unmarked convoy threading silently through dark, tree-lined avenues. The winter air sharpened as they climbed. Frost clung to the branches, sparkling faintly in the moonlight. And there, crowning the hill, stood the Ashby Crest Estate, a fortress masquerading as a mansion. The estate's stone walls loomed tall, their weathered gray faces broken only by narrow slits of light from high windows. The wrought iron gates, adorned with ornamental thorns, stood rigid and black, exhaling cold like an iron lung. The driveway curved upward into shadows, lined with manicured hedges, too precise to belong to a home of warmth. It was the kind of place designed not for family, but for power, a castle of old money turned modern citadel. Inside Luke's cruiser, Ranger shifted restlessly in the back seat, his nose pressed against the air vent, catching scents carried faintly even here. His body was taut, amber eyes wide, his every muscle telling Luke he already knew what waited behind those walls. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tight in her lap, her face reflected in the windshield as they approached the gates, her glasses catching the pale light. She had grown up passing houses like this from afar, watching as privilege walled itself away from neighborhoods like hers. The irony stung that children from her streets might be suffering in the belly of such a palace. At the gate, 2 more vehicles pulled up, tactical units in plain clothes. Among them was Captain Richard Holloway, the commanding officer overseeing the operation. Holloway was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with thinning sandy hair combed flat, his uniform jacket perfectly pressed. His face carried the stern lines of a man who had built his career on authority, and his cool blue eyes rarely wavered. Yet beneath his discipline there lingered a trace of condescension toward those outside his rank. As the convoy idled, Vanessa leaned forward, laying out a cautious approach. "If they're keeping anyone here, the children will be in the lower levels. We need to minimize noise, go through the service entrance on the west side. Surveillance cameras, if they're like the harbor, will have blind spots between rotations. We can use that." But Holloway waved his hand dismissively before she finished. "We'll run this by the book. Secure perimeter, full breach at the main entrance, no side theatrics." Luke frowned, glancing at Vanessa. "She's right. A loud breach could put hostages at risk. The west side will buy us a cleaner entry." Holloway's jaw flexed. He studied Luke briefly, then nodded once. "Fine, we'll do it that way." Vanessa didn't speak, but a bitter smile ghosted her lips. She had watched men like Holloway dismiss her voice too many times, only to nod when a man echoed her words. She adjusted her scarf, the tiny cut on her cheek still stinging from the warehouse. It wasn't the first time her presence had been undermined, and it wouldn't be the last. The team moved. They cut through the hedges, flashlights doused, steps muffled against frosted grass. Ranger led, his nose twitching, ears alert. At the western side of the estate, an unassuming service door stood beneath ivy-choked stone. Crates lined the delivery yard, some marked with luxury imports, others plain cardboard sealed with heavy tape. Ranger stiffened near one, sniffing hard. He barked once, sharply, then pawed the corner. Luke crouched, slicing the tape with his knife. Inside the crate, stacked among linens, were several empty glass vials, their labels smudged. The air around them reeked sharp, chemical, unmistakable, chloroform. Enough to drug dozens of children. Luke's stomach tightened as he sealed the crate back up. Vanessa's voice was low, controlled. "So this is where the harbor trail leads. They move them through here." The service door creaked open into a dim corridor lined with stone. The walls smelled faintly of polish and cigar smoke, the air heated but oppressive. Paintings hung along the hallway, heavy oil portraits of men in dark coats, their eyes watching coldly from gilded frames. The hush was thick, broken only by the hum of heating ducts and the faint click of Ranger's nails. They moved deeper until they reached double doors of dark wood. Luke pushed them open into a vast study. The room gleamed with wealth, mahogany shelves stacked with leather-bound books, a chandelier dripping with crystal, the scent of aged whiskey clinging to the air. A fire smoldered low in the hearth, casting golden light across the ornate carpet. But something about the space was too pristine, as if curated to hide what truly lay beneath. Ranger paced the perimeter, nose to the floor. His body froze near the eastern wall. He barked once, then twice, scratching at the base of a towering bookshelf lined with encyclopedias. Luke approached, running his hands along the carved edges. A faint groove betrayed a seam. With a shove, the shelf groaned and slid sideways on hidden tracks, revealing darkness beyond. A rush of cold air struck them, smelling of damp stone and rusted metal. The passage descended in narrow steps into shadow, a throat swallowing them downward. Luke tightened his grip on his pistol. Vanessa adjusted her glasses, her face pale but resolute. Ranger stood at the threshold, his tail stiff, his gaze fixed ahead. He didn't growl, he didn't bark, he simply stared, his amber eyes glowing like twin lanterns, as though warning them that the heart of darkness was close. The hidden stairwell behind the sliding bookshelf led downward, the stone steps slick with condensation, the air growing heavier with every step. Luke's flashlight beam swept across damp walls etched with mineral veins. Vanessa followed close behind, her hand brushing the wall for balance, her glasses fogging slightly in the humid chill. Ranger moved first, his paws silent but deliberate, every muscle in his body taut like a coiled spring, the faint bloodstain from the harbor fight still clinging to his fur. The tunnel stretched long, the echoes of their movement swallowed by the oppressive silence. The smell grew stronger: oil, salt water, and the faint sting of gasoline. Luke recognized it instantly. A private dock. When they emerged, the tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber that sloped down toward the water. Dim overhead lights cast a sickly glow over the scene. A subterranean boat slip carved directly beneath the estate. A sleek motor yacht rocked gently against the dock, its engines already humming. Crates lined the platform, some labeled with export markings, others unmarked, stacked hastily. And there, herded in a group under guard, were children, 8 of them, still wrapped in the same emergency blankets the traffickers had stolen from city supplies. Their eyes were wide, some too weak to cry, others clinging to one another. Standing near the gangplank directing his men was Martin Ashford. He was every inch the aristocrat-turned-predator, tall, broad-shouldered, in his late 40s, with silvering hair combed immaculately back. His tailored coat contrasted grotesquely with the filth of the dock, and in his gloved hand he held a polished pistol. His face bore the calm arrogance of a man who believed money made him untouchable. Beneath his composure, though, flickered the restless energy of someone cornered. Beside him stood a handful of guards. One in particular caught Luke's eye. Samuel Dyer, mid-30s, lean and long-limbed, with dark stubble and a sunken face. His hollow cheeks gave him a perpetual scowl, and his left eye twitched subtly when nervous. Samuel had grown up in Baltimore's roughest neighborhoods, once a bright athlete before injury crushed his future. Bitterness had festered into cruelty, and now he wielded it in the service of whoever paid best. He leveled a shotgun toward the children, his voice sharp as he barked at them to move. Ranger's growl reverberated through the chamber, echoing like a primal challenge. The children's heads lifted, eyes focusing on the shepherd as though hope itself had walked into the room. Luke raised his pistol, voice thunderous. "Baltimore PD, drop your weapons!" Ashford's head snapped up, his aristocratic mask cracking just slightly as he spotted Luke, Vanessa, and Ranger. For the first time, his voice lost its calm. "Stop them! Get those kids on the boat!" Gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes seared against the damp air, ricocheting sparks off the steel supports. Luke dove for cover behind a crate, returning fire with precision. Vanessa crouched low, darting toward the group of children, her arms spread, shouting for them to stay down. Ranger bolted forward like a missile, his paws hammering the wet dock planks. Samuel fired his shotgun, the blast tearing splinters into the air. The shot missed by inches, but fragments struck Ranger's flank. He yelped, staggered for a split second, then surged onward with renewed fury. Martin Ashford turned, lifting his pistol toward Ranger. His face twisted, veins bulging with the exertion of rage. He fired. The bullet grazed Ranger's back, slicing fur and skin, leaving a burning streak of red. Ranger faltered, but his momentum never broke. With a guttural snarl, he launched upward, colliding with Ashford. The gun flew from Ashford's grip, skittering across the dock into the water. Luke stormed forward, slamming Ashford against the railing. The man fought like a trapped animal, his fists flying, but Luke pinned him, snapping a pair of handcuffs over his wrists. "It's over," Luke hissed, his voice low, final. Behind them, Vanessa reached the children. She pulled the closest boy into her arms, whispering, "You're safe now. You're safe." With quick hands, she guided them away from the line of fire, shielding their small bodies with her own. Her cheeks still bore the thin scar from the warehouse, and now fresh sweat streaked down her face, but her eyes burned with determination. Samuel tried to reload his shotgun, but Ranger, despite the blood streaking his fur, barreled into him with the force of a battering ram. The man tumbled backward, his weapon skidding across the concrete. Ranger stood over him, fangs bared, chest heaving, every inch the guardian he had been born to be. Ashford spat, his voice breaking into a roar even as Luke pressed him to the ground. "You think you've won? You think this ends with me? I'm nothing but a link in the chain. There are others bigger, richer, untouchable. You're ants fighting the ocean." Luke's grip tightened on the man's collar. His gray eyes flashed with fury. "You're done." Ashford laughed then, a cruel, bitter sound that echoed against the stone walls. "Ants can't stop tides." At that moment, Ranger growled, deep and guttural, the sound vibrating through the chamber. It silenced Ashford's laughter, drowned it in primal defiance. The shepherd's gaze fixed on him, eyes burning like amber fire, as if answering for every silenced child in the shadows. Vanessa, still holding the hand of a trembling girl, looked back at Ashford with ice in her voice. "Maybe ants can't stop tides, but together they can bring down empires." The children clung to her, eyes wide, their sobs breaking into shaky breaths as the sound of Ranger's growl filled the chamber like a vow. The courtroom air was heavy, thick with the scent of polished wood and ink, the kind of silence that held its breath for justice. Martin Ashford stood in chains, his once immaculate suit crumpled, his silver hair damp from sweat. His face still wore the arrogant mask of privilege, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear as the prosecutor read out the charges: human trafficking, child endangerment, conspiracy, and a dozen more stacked like bricks that would seal his fate. The jury's forewoman, a middle-aged woman with short auburn hair and stern, weary eyes, delivered the verdict with a voice steady as steel: "Guilty on all counts." A murmur rippled across the chamber. Then applause rose from the gallery where families of rescued children sat clutching one another, tears flowing freely. The children, though too young to understand the full scope of the trial, knew enough to feel the tide had shifted. They were now safe. They would no longer wake to the sound of chains rattling or the barked orders of men like Samuel Dyer. Instead, they were escorted by volunteers and social workers to the Baltimore Youth Recovery Center, a sprawling brick building on a quiet street where murals of sunflowers and painted handprints decorated the walls. Inside, the director of the center, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, welcomed them. Eleanor was in her late 50s, short and stout, with soft silver curls and gentle eyes behind thick glasses. Her voice carried both warmth and authority, the voice of someone who had seen too many broken children pass through her doors and vowed never to let the world crush them again. She greeted each child by kneeling, looking directly into their eyes and assuring them they were not alone. Ranger padded into the center with Luke and Vanessa, his amber eyes watchful, his scarred flank still bandaged, but healing. At once the children swarmed him, their hands reaching to stroke his fur, their laughter spilling out in nervous bursts as if testing the sound of joy again. Ranger stood tall and proud, tail sweeping in slow arcs, letting them cling to him, nuzzle into his chest, and bury their fears in his warmth. Vanessa stood in the doorway for a moment, almost hesitant. She was unused to belonging in such spaces. Her tall, lean frame seemed both graceful and uncertain. Her dark skin, once a target for whispered judgment, now reflected the morning light from the center's wide windows. She adjusted her glasses, her hand trembling slightly as she watched the children lean against her and Ranger in equal measure. The days that followed led to a ceremony at Baltimore City Hall. The building's marble steps gleamed under the rising sun, banners unfurled with the city's seal, and the mayor's voice echoed as citizens gathered, news cameras poised like watchful birds. The hall inside was filled with police officers, civic leaders, social workers, and the children themselves, seated in the front rows, their hair combed, their cheeks freshly scrubbed, their clothes donated but worn with a dignity no uniform could replicate. Luke, in his formal dark blue uniform with polished shoes and his badge gleaming, stood at the podium. His square jaw was tense, his voice steady though heavy with emotion. "Today, we honor bravery. But I must be clear, the true heroes of this story are not me. The true heroes are Ranger, whose courage defied bullets, and Vanessa Green, who refused to let fear or prejudice stop her from shielding the children." For a long breath, silence hung in the hall. The weight of his words pressed against centuries of unspoken bias, the shadows of doubt cast on women like Vanessa. Then, as if a dam had broken, the room erupted in applause. It rolled through the chamber like thunder, officers clapping alongside civilians, reporters lowering their cameras for just a second to join in. Vanessa, seated beside the children, covered her face with her hands. When she lowered them, tears had streaked her cheeks. She was not a woman easily shaken. Years of dismissal, of being overlooked in newsrooms, had built a wall around her heart. But in that moment, the wall cracked. A small boy in the front row tugged at her sleeve and handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it and found a drawing. Crude crayons had sketched a smiling woman with glasses, standing beside a great German shepherd, both framed beneath a glowing yellow sun. The lines were shaky, the colors outside the borders, but it was more beautiful to her than any award. Then came a softer voice, so quiet Vanessa almost missed it. A little girl with tightly braided hair, no more than 6, leaned close and whispered, "You look like my mommy." The words pierced her deeper than any applause. Vanessa bent down, cupped the girl's face in her hands, and pressed her forehead to the child's. For the first time, she felt she was being seen not through the lens of her skin, but through the reflection of her heart. Luke, watching from the podium, felt his throat tighten. He had known Vanessa as the sharp-tongued journalist who refused to back down, but here she was, revealed in her truest form, the embodiment of compassion. And then, as if on cue, Ranger made his own statement. Luke, in his nervous pride, had been holding half of a hot dog from the refreshment table. Without hesitation, Ranger bounded up, snatched it clean from his hand, and trotted proudly back to the children, who erupted in laughter. The sight of the imposing German shepherd chewing gleefully while crumbs dropped onto the mayor's polished floor was enough to send the entire hall into a chorus of chuckles. Even the most stoic officers cracked smiles, and the mayor himself slapped his knee in amusement. In that shared laughter, years of suspicion, bitterness, and pain seemed to dissolve. The sound filled the chamber, brighter than any anthem, lighter than any sermon. For a brief and shining moment, everyone, officer and child, black and white, wounded and whole, was united in a single breath of joy. The applause resumed, not just for medals or speeches, but for something larger, the belief that the city, fractured though it was, could still rise to meet a new dawn. Outside the hall, the Baltimore skyline caught the first rays of sunrise, painting the harbor gold. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp but free. On the steps below, citizens gathered, clapping, cheering, and even wiping their eyes. Vanessa walked out with the children at her side, Ranger padding between them like a sentry. Luke followed, his chest swelling with something more lasting than pride, hope. For though the chains of men like Ashford had been broken, the greater victory was here, etched not in laws or verdicts, but in the fragile, powerful trust that had been restored. Baltimore's dawn had never looked so bright. This story is not only about a dramatic rescue, but also a reminder that miracles often appear in unexpected forms. Justice became whole when every heart and every voice stood together, beyond color or status. Ranger showed us the instinct of justice, Luke represented action, and Vanessa carried the voice of compassion that rose above prejudice. Just as the dawn broke over Baltimore, God's light breaks through the darkest nights of our lives, if only we choose to believe. In our daily struggles, may we remember that courage, love, and faith can turn pain into hope and division into unity. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and write Amen if you believe God still works wonders through love and unity. Do not forget to subscribe for more stories of faith and redemption. May the Lord bless you and your family abundantly.